Organs Without Bodies. Deleuze and Consequences. By Slavoj Zizek. Against Hyphenethics. What is false with today's discussion concerning the ethical consequences of biogenetics, along with similar matters, is that it is rapidly turning into what Germans call Bindenstrich, the ethics of the hyphen technology ethics, environment ethics, and so on. This ethics does have a role to play, a role homologous to that of the provisional ethic Descartes mentions at the beginning of his discourse on method. When we engage on a new path, full of dangers and shattering new insights, we need to stick to old established rules as a practical guide for our daily lives, although we are well aware that the new insights will compel us to provide a fresh foundation for our entire ethical edifice. In Descartes' case, this new foundation was provided by Kant, in his Ethics of Subjective Autonomy. Today we are in the same predicament. The provisional ethics cannot replace the need for a thorough reflection of the emerging new. In short, what gets lost here, in this hyphen ethics, is simply ethics as such. The problem is not that universal ethics gets dissolved in particular topics but, on the contrary, that particular scientific breakthroughs are directly confronted with the old humanist values, say, how biogenetics affects our sense of dignity and autonomy. This, then, is the choice we are confronting today. Either we choose the typically postmodern stance of reticence, let's not go to the end, let's keep a proper distance toward the scientific thing so that this thing will not draw us into its black hole, destroying all our moral and human notions, or we dare to tarry with the negative, das Verwellen beim Negativen, that is, we dare to fully assume the consequences of scientific modernity, with the wager that our mind as a genome will also function as an infinite judgment. The main consequence of the scientific breakthroughs in biogenetics is the end of nature. Once we know the rules of its construction, natural organisms are transformed into objects amenable to manipulation. Nature, human and inhuman, is thus desubstantialized, deprived of its impenetrable density, of what Heidegger called earth. Biogenetics, with its reduction of the human psyche itself to an object of technological manipulation, is therefore effectively a kind of empirical instantiation of what Heidegger perceived as the danger inherent to modern technology. Crucial here is the interdependence of man and nature. By reducing man to just another natural object whose properties can be manipulated, what we lose is not only humanity but nature itself. In this sense, Francis Fukuyama is right. Humanity itself relies on some notion of human nature as what we inherited and was simply given to us, the impenetrable dimension of ourselves into which we are born/thrown. The paradox is thus that there is man only insofar as there is impenetrable in human nature, Heidegger's earth. How, then, do we react to this threat? Recall the well-known case of Huntington's disease. The gene directly responsible for it was isolated, and each of us can learn precisely not only if he will get Huntington's but also when he will get it. It depends on a genetic transcription mistake, the stuttering repetition of the word CAG in the middle of this gene. The age at which the madness will appear depends strictly and implacably on the number of repetitions of CAG in one place in this gene. If there are 40 repetitions, you will get the first symptoms at 59, if 41, at 54, if 50, at 27. Good living, bodily fitness, the best medicine, healthy food, as well as family love and support can do nothing about it. It is pure fatalism, undiluted by environmental variability. There are, as yet, no cures, we can do nothing about it. So, what should we do when we know that we can submit ourselves to testing and thus acquire a knowledge that, if positive, tells us exactly when we will go mad and die? Can one imagine a clearer situation of traversing the fantasy and being confronted with the utterly meaningless real of a contingency determining our life? No wonder that the majority of people, including the scientist who identified this gene, choose ignorance. This ignorance is not simply negative, since its void opens up the place for fantasizing. Furthermore, with the prospect of biogenetic interventions opened up by the access to the genome, the species freely changes/redefines itself, its own coordinates, The access to the genome effectively emancipates humankind from the constraints of a finite species, from its enslavement to the selfish genes. This emancipation, however, comes at a price. During a talk in Marburg, Habermas repeated his warnings against biogenetic manipulations with humans. With interventions into man's genetic inheritance, the domination over nature reverts into an act of taking control over oneself, which changes our generic ethical self-understanding and can disturb the necessary conditions for an autonomous way of life and universalistic understanding of morals. Habermas sees two threats lurking here. First, such interventions blur the borderline between what we made and what grew up spontaneously, thereby affecting the individual's self-understanding. How will an adolescent react upon learning that his spontaneous, say, aggressive or peaceful, dispositions are the result of others' intentional intervention into his genetic code? Will this not undermine the very heart of his identity as a person, namely, the notion that we develop our moral identity through Bildung, the painful struggle to form/educate one's natural dispositions? Ultimately, the prospect of direct biogenetic interventions renders the very notion of education meaningless. Second, at the intersubjective level, such biogenetic interventions will give birth to asymmetrical relations between those who are spontaneously human and those whose characteristics were artificially manipulated. Some people will appear as privileged creators of others. At the most elementary level, this affects our sexual identity. What is at stake here is not only the possibility of parents choosing the sex of their offspring but also the status of sex-changing operations. Up until now, it was possible to justify them by evoking the gap between one's biological and one's psychic sexual identity. When a biological man experiences himself as a woman trapped in a man's body, why shouldn't he be allowed to change her biological sex and thus introduce balance into her sexual and emotional life? However, the prospect of biogenetic manipulation opens up the much more radical possibility of manipulating psychic identity itself. Although this argumentation is impeccable in its simplicity, there is one big problem with it. Does the very fact of the possibility of biogenetic manipulations not retroactively change the self-understanding of ourselves as natural beings, in the sense that we now experience our natural dispositions themselves as something mediated, not simply as something immediately given but as something that can be in principle manipulated, and is thus simply contingent? The key point here is that there is no return to the preceding naive immediacy. Once we know that our natural dispositions depend on blind genetic contingency, every stubborn sticking to these dispositions is as fake as sticking to old organic mores in a modern universe. So, basically, what Habermas is saying is although we now know that our dispositions depend on meaningless genetic contingency, let us pretend and act as if this is not the case so that we can maintain our sense of dignity and autonomy. The paradox is here that autonomy can only be maintained by prohibiting access to the blind natural contingency that determines us, that is, ultimately, by limiting our autonomy and freedom of scientific intervention. Although, at some radical level, autonomy is linked to contingency, there is something humiliating in knowing exactly when I will die. Back in the 1950s, there was a death row prisoner in the United States who, from the scarce materials at his disposal, metal pipes of his bed, the chemicals of the playing cards colors, etc., improvised a gun that, every night, he aimed at his head. The gun was constructed so that the prisoner did not know when, exactly, it would fire off and kill him. When it happened, he died suddenly and of his own hand, thus asserting the minimum of his autonomy. Is this not a new version of the old conservative argument that, if we are to retain our moral dignity, it is better not to know certain things? Again, Habermas's logic is here, since the results of science pose threat to our predominant notion of autonomy and freedom, one should curtail science. The price we pay for this solution is the fetishist split between science and ethics. I know very well what science claims, but, nonetheless, in order to retain the appearance of my autonomy, I choose to ignore it and act as if I don't know it. This prevents us from confronting the true question: How do these new conditions compel us to transform and reinvent the very notions of freedom, autonomy, and ethical responsibility? However, what about the possible Catholic counterargument according to which the true danger is not our effective reduction to non-spiritual entities but the very fact that, in biogenetics, we men treat ourselves as such? In other words, the point is not that we have or we do not have an immortal soul, and so forth, of course we do, but that, in engaging with biogenetics, we lose the awareness of this status and treat ourselves as if we are merely biological organisms. This only displaces the problem. Would not, if such is the case, Catholic believers be the ideal subjects to engage fully in biogenetic manipulations, since they would be completely aware that they are dealing only with the material aspect of human existence, not with the very spiritual kernel of man? In short, they should be allowed to do whatever they want in biogenetics, since their faith in the human soul, in a transcendent spiritual dimension, would protect them from reducing man to the object of their scientific manipulations. Our question thus returns with a vengeance: if men have an immortal soul or an autonomous spiritual dimension, why, then, fear biogenetic manipulations? The further religious counterargument is that, with the soul as independent of the body, brain, our body is its God-created instrument, namely, the way the soul expresses itself in this world. So, if we mess with its basic structure too much, we may disturb a precise structure created by God as a receptacle for our soul, thus obfuscating the soul's expression, in the same way that radio is just an instrument for receiving waves and thereby rendering audible the transmitted message. If we mess with it too much, the transmission no longer works. However, this counterargument is also ambiguous. If we can understand the way the instrument works, why should we abstain from improving it? From the psychoanalytic standpoint, the core of the problem resides in the autonomy of the symbolic order. Suppose I am impotent because of some unresolved blockade in my symbolic universe, and I take Viagra instead of educating myself through the work of resolving the symbolic hindrance/inhibition. The solution works, I am again able to perform sexually. But the problem remains: how will the symbolic blockade itself be affected by the solution? How will the solution be subjectivized? The situation here is thoroughly undecidable. The solution will not be experienced as the result of the symbolic working through of the blockade. As such, it can unblock the symbolic obstacle itself, compelling me to accept its utter meaninglessness, or it can generate a psychotic twist, causing the return of the obstacle at some more fundamental psychotic level. Say, I am pushed into a paranoiac attitude, experiencing myself as exposed to the caprice of some master whose interventions can decide my destiny. There is always a symbolic price to be paid for such unearned solutions. And, mutatis mutandis, the same goes for the attempts to fight crime through direct biochemical or biogenetic intervention. When one fights crime by submitting the criminals to biochemical treatment, compelling them to take medications against excessive aggression, one leaves intact the social mechanisms that triggered these potentials for aggression in the individuals. In his Kinds of Minds, Dennett reports on the Capgras delusion, the sufferer's conviction that a close acquaintance, usually a loved one, has been replaced by an impostor who looks like, and sounds like and acts like, the genuine companion, who has mysteriously disappeared. The sufferers sometimes go so far as to murder their spouses, who they consider to be impostors. Dennett sees the solution of this enigmatic mental illness in the hypothesis elaborated by Andrew Young apropos of prosopagnosia: people who cannot recognize familiar human faces, say, they cannot identify their closest friends until they hear them speak. However, when they are shown photographs of anonymous people, celebrities, and their close friends, they show a heightened galvanic skin response when they are shown a person they know, although they claim not to recognize them. So, something in them nonetheless did recognize them. Young's conclusion is that there must be, at least, two different systems of identifying a face in our psyche: the overt, conscious face recognition system and the covert system, which normally provides a reassuring vote of agreement. In the case of prosopagnosia, the overt system is impaired while the covert system continues to function. What if, then, In the case of Capgras delusion, we have the opposite malfunctioning. The overt face recognition functions normally, but it lacks the covert vote of agreement and, logically, the result is thus experienced as although this person looks and acts exactly like my wife, something is missing, she must be an imposter. Do we not encounter here the gap between the series of positive properties and the mysterious gene sais qua that accounts for the person's self-identity beyond all positive properties, what Lacan calls objet petit, something in you more than yourself? There is, however, one problem with Dennett's and Jung's explanation: it is not all faces that provoke this paranoiac reaction but just one close acquaintance, usually a loved one. How, without a reference to inherent psychological dynamics, can we account for this selective malfunctioning of the covert system that is not suspended in general but only when it confronts one beloved face? Another lesson of psychoanalysis here is that, contrary to the notion that curiosity is inborn and innate in humans, there is, deep within each of us, a Wissenstrieb, a drive to know. The spontaneous attitude of a human being is that of "I don't want to know about it." The fundamental desire is the desire not to know too much. Every true progress in knowledge has to be brought about by a painful struggle against our spontaneous propensities. Let's, for a moment, return to Huntington's disease. If there is, in my family, a history of this disease, should I take the test that will tell me if, and when, I will inexorably get the disease? If I cannot bear the prospect of knowing when I will die, the, more phantasmatic than realistic, ideal solution may seem to be the following one. I authorize another person or institution whom I trust completely to test me and not to tell me the result, only to kill me unexpectedly and painlessly in my sleep just before the onslaught of the fatal illness, assuming the result to be positive. However, the problem with this solution is that I know that the other knows the truth about my illness, and this ruins everything, exposing me to horrifying, gnawing suspicion. Is, then, the ideal solution the opposite one? If I suspect that my child may have the disease, I test him without him knowing it and then kill him painlessly just before the onslaught. The ultimate fantasy here would be that of an anonymous state institution doing this for all of us without our knowledge. But, again, the question pops up, do we know about it, that the other knows, or not? The way toward a perfect totalitarian society is open. What is false here is the underlying premise, the notion that the ultimate ethical duty is that of protecting the other from pain, of keeping him in protective ignorance. After we learn some bad news, we would prefer not to know it, but we cannot go back once we know it, there is no return to innocent ignorance. The most recent case of this is provided by biogenetics. When we learn to manipulate even our psychic properties, this, of course, demystifies our perception of human nature, undermining our sense of personal dignity. However, the preceding ignorance appears as blessed only from the perspective of this knowledge. In other words, it is only after losing this blessed ignorance that we learn how blessed we were. It is similar with the celebration, in movies and narratives, of a lone hero who accomplishes his sacrificial act for the good of others unseen, without others being aware of it. Although people around him ignore him or even laugh at him, he is deeply satisfied in and with himself, or is he? Is it not, rather, that he did it for the big other who appears precisely at this point at which there are no real others to take note of him? In other words, does not the satisfaction he gets emerge from the imagined gaze that observes him? This big other is eventually embodied in us, spectators, as if the hero knows he is part of a film, or, at least, part of a story. The concept of the big other, with its ambiguous virtual status, is, in itself, a compromise. The avoidance of both terms of the alternative confronts us, or to quote Arthur Clarke, either we are alone in the universe with no other intelligent beings out there, or we are not alone. Both possibilities are equally terrifying. The big other is thus something in between, enabling us to have our cake and eat it too. There is no real other out there, but there is nonetheless the fiction of the big other that enables us to avoid the horror of being alone. Recall, also, the well-known paradox of the choice a group of 4 military commandos has to make. If all of them participate in a dangerous action, they have a 50% chance of getting killed. If only one of them, chosen by a lottery, does it, he will be killed for sure, so the chance of survival is 25%. Although the rational strategy is to choose the second option, which involves a 100% greater survival chance than the first one, a large majority of people would choose the first option. Although I have a greater chance of getting killed, the outcome is open until the end, i.e., I can retain my hope the entire time, never taking the risk of finding myself in a position in which I know for sure that I will soon die. What all of these 3 cases share is the temporality in which the choice is not simply a choice among different possibilities. The act of choice changes its own terms. So, back to our basic point, it is not so much that, with biogenetics, we lose our freedom and dignity. Rather, we experience that we never had them in the first place. If, today, we already have therapies that blur the line between what we achieve on our own and what we achieve because of the levels of various chemicals in our brains, does not the very efficiency of these therapies imply that what we achieve on our own also depends on different levels of various chemicals in our brains? Hence, it is not that, to quote Tom Wolfe's famous title, we are told sorry, but your soul just died. What we are effectively told is that we never had a soul in the first place. If the claims of biogenetics hold, then the choice we are confronting today is not between human dignity and the post-human technological generation of individuals, but between clinging to the illusion of dignity and accepting the reality of what we are. Thus, when Francis Fukuyama states that the desire for recognition has a biological basis and that that basis is related to levels of serotonin in the brain, does not our very awareness of this fact undermine the feeling of dignity that comes from being recognized by others? One cannot have it on both levels simultaneously. One can have it only at the price of a fetishist disavowal. Although I know very well that my self-esteem depends on serotonin, I nonetheless enjoy it. On the following page, Fukuyama deploys the matrix of the 3 levels of achieving self-esteem. The normal, and morally acceptable, way of overcoming low self-esteem was to struggle with oneself and with others, to work hard, to endure sometimes painful sacrifices, and finally to rise and be seen as having done so. The problem with self-esteem as it is understood in American pop psychology is that it becomes an entitlement, something everyone needs to have whether it is deserved or not. This devalues self-esteem and makes the quest for it self-defeating. But now along comes the American pharmaceutical industry, which through drugs like Zoloft and Prozac can provide self-esteem in a bottle by elevating brain serotonin. The difference between the second and third options is much more uncanny than it may initially appear to be. They are not fake in the same way. When I get self-esteem because society agrees that I am entitled to it and provides the recognition of my peers, this effectively is a self-defeating, performative paradox. However, when I get it through drugs, I get the real thing. Let us imagine the following scenario: I participate in a quiz competition. Instead of the hard process of learning, I enhance my memory with drugs. However, my self-esteem, which I get by way of winning the competition, is still based on the real achievement, that is, I really performed better than my colleague, who spent many nights trying to learn all the relevant data about the quiz topic. The obvious intuitive counterargument here is that it is only my competitor who has the right to be truly proud because his result was the outcome of hard work and painful dedication. However, is there not something inherently humiliating and patronizing in such a stance, as when we say to a mentally impaired person who successfully weaves the proverbial basket, "You should be proud of what you did"? Even more, is it not that, say, we perceive it as justified when someone, with a breathtaking natural talent for singing, takes pride in his performance, although we are aware that his singing is based more on his talent than on his effort and training? The old Mozart-Salieri problem. Salieri's envy at how Mozart, composing with ease, produced superior works to those of Salieri, despite the latter's excruciating effort and dedication. And yet, if I were to improve my singing through a drug, I would be denied the esteem, with the exception of the situation in which I would put great effort into inventing such a drug and then testing it on myself. It is thus not simply hard work and struggle versus the help of a drug. The point is, rather, that hard work as well as natural talent are considered part of me, of myself, whereas drug enhancement results from an external manipulation. And, again, this brings us back to the same problem. Once we know that my natural talent depends on some chemicals in my brain, does it really matter, morally, if I got it from outside or from natural birth? To complicate things even further, what if my willingness itself to engage in inner struggle, discipline, and hard work depends on some chemicals? So, what if, to win a quiz competition, I do not take directly a drug that enhances my memory but merely a drug that strengthens my resolve and dedication? Is this still cheating? And, the final, but crucial, twist, is the self-esteem that I gain through real achievements really a priori deserved? Is it not that, on account, not only of social injustice, but, of the gap between the level of real achievements and their recognition in a symbolic public ritual, recognition adds something to real performance? Long ago, Lacan emphasized why, even when we know how we scored, there is a minimal gap between this objective knowledge and its performative proclamation bestowing on us a title. The problem with drugs is thus not simply that they generate an undeserved self-esteem, a self-esteem not grounded in our real achievements, but, more paradoxically, that they deprive us of the satisfaction provided by the intersubjective symbolic ritual. Why, then, did Fukuyama pass from the end of history defense of liberal democracy to the threat posed by brain sciences? In a first approach, the answer seems easy. The biogenetic threat is a new, much more radical, version of the end of history, which undermines the very foundations of liberal democracy. The new scientific and technological developments potentially render obsolete the free and autonomous liberal democratic subject. There is, however, a deeper reason for Fukuyama's turn to the brain sciences, a reason that directly concerns his political vision. It is as if the prospect of biogenetic manipulations forced Fukuyama to take note of the dark obverse of his idealized image of liberal democracy. All of a sudden, apropos the biogenetic threat, he is compelled to affirm all of the things that magically vanished from his liberal democratic utopia. The prospect of biogenetic interventions and other forms of brain manipulations opens up the dark prospects of corporations misusing the free market to manipulate people and to engage in terrifying medical experiments, of rich people breeding their offspring as a special race with superior mental and physical capacities, thus instigating a new class warfare, and similar nightmarish scenarios. It is clear to Fukuyama that the only way to limit this danger is to reassert a strong state control of the market and to develop new forms of democratic political will. While agreeing with all of this, one is tempted to add the following: do we not need these measures also independently of the biogenetic threat, just in order to control the terrifying potentials of the global market economy itself? Maybe the problem is not biogenetics as such but, rather, the social context of power relations within which it functions. What makes biogenetics dangerous is the way its use is determined by the interests of corporate capital and of the state agencies tempted to rely on it in order to increase their control of the population. The problem is ultimately not ethical but economico-political. The difficulty with Fukuyama is thus double: his argumentation is, at one and the same time, too abstract and too concrete. He fails to question the full philosophical implications of the new brain sciences and related technologies, and he fails to locate these sciences and technologies in their antagonistic socio-economic context. What Fukuyama does not grasp, and what a true Hegelian should have grasped, is the necessary link between the two ends of history, the necessary passage from the one to the other. The liberal democratic end of history immediately turns into its opposite since, in the very hour of its triumph, it starts to lose its very foundation, the liberal democratic subject itself. So, what would Hegel have said apropos the genome project and biogenetic interventions? Whatever his reaction, it would definitely not have been to shirk away out of fear, preferring ignorance to risk. From a proper Hegelian perspective, one has to go through this thorough self-objectivization, since it is only through it that the subject as pure form, the pure form of the subject, emerges, as the point from which I can apprehend with horror how that's me, that genetic formula. In short, would not Hegel rejoice at thou art genome, at this shattering new version of the old thou art that, as the ultimate example of the infinite judgment, completing the series of the spirit is a bone and the self is money? The confrontation with the meaningless real of the genome thus obliterates the fantasy screen through which I perceive reality. In the formula of the genome, I am compelled to directly access the real. Contrary to Habermas, one should assert the ethical necessity of assuming the full genome objectivization. This reduction of my substantial being to the senseless genome formula obliterates the phantasmatic étoffe du moi, the stuff of which our egos are made, thereby reducing me to the pure subject. Faced with the genome, I am nothing, and this nothing is the subject itself. The post-secular striving to formulate the limits of disenchantment all too quickly accepts the premise that the inherent logic of enlightenment ends up in the total scientific self-objectivization of humanity, in the transformation of humans into available objects of scientific manipulation, so that the only way to retain human dignity is to salvage religious legacy by way of translating it into a modern idiom. Against this temptation, it is crucial to insist to the end in the project of enlightenment. Enlightenment remains an unfinished project that has to be brought to its end, and this end is not the total scientific self-objectivization, but this wager has to be taken a new figure of freedom that will emerge when we follow the logic of science to the end.